welcome to another episode from The Word Shared, a podcast from the Leaders of Worship and Preachers Trust and Preach magazine. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope this conversation and this article reading will enrich you and equip you on your journey. My name is Tanya Stead. I'm the editor of Preach magazine and content manager here at the Leaders of Worship and Preachers Trust. So today, joining us is Mark Woods. Hi, Mark. Nice to have you.
Hi, Tanya. Nice to be here.
It's been a great settling into a editorial position and having Mark Woods, a friend and supporter, coming alongside and writing and contributing. So the conversations we've had since I've been on the team have been wonderful. But Mark, do you remember how many years you might have been in partnership with us?
Gosh, I think it probably goes back 7 or 8 years. That's my guess. Probably about 8 years, I think. So I've had some really fascinating conversations with different editors, and it's been wonderful to see the magazine particularly just grow and flourish as it has. It's been just really, really marvelous to see that.
Awesome. So thank you, Mark, for joining us. This episode, you'll be reading from one of the articles that you wrote for us. And the first article we'll get into is from issue 15, and that was in 2018. So maybe one of the first, and it's really encouraging and helpful. Before we get into that, I would like to ask you a question so that we can just get to know you a little bit more just before I make a formal introduction. So the question I have for you today is there a moment in your ministry that still makes you smile or laugh when you think about it?
Yes, very much so. And I suppose it makes me look a bit hapless, but that's okay. And I'm thinking about the time when I took a wedding in my little village church, and the wedding was being videoed, and everything was lovely, everything was fine, until the moment when I held out my prayer book and asked the best man to put the rings on the prayer book, and he put the rings on the prayer book, and they slid gently off and rolled all over the floor, leaving me scrabbling to pick them up in a most undignified way. So that makes me smile. And the other thing that makes me smile is that the happy couple sent off the wedding video to Channel 5 for a sort of clip show of great wedding disasters. So somewhere in Channel 5's archives, I am there scrabbling around on the floor looking ridiculous. So that makes me smile.
Oh, I love that. That it's a memory that makes something special, and that's so lovely. And they'll remember that, obviously, because they'll tell their grandchildren one day all about it.
So I think they probably got paid for it as well. So that's another good memory for them. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Thanks for sharing that. Before we get into the reading of the article, the issue that was themed around vulnerability and preaching. And it's all about being, as a minister, as pastors, as those who preach, those who share the word, there's a sense of what stories do you tell? How vulnerable can you be? Where can you show your vulnerability? And in this article, you titled Personal Experience. And so without giving anything away, I'm just to introduce you and then hand over to you to read from this article. So Mark Woods, Head of Communications at Bible Society, a Baptist minister, a brilliant writer, and a friend of us, of Leaders of Worship and Preachers Trust and Preach magazine, having served many years on the Preach magazine editorial committee. So over to you, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Tanya. Okay, so the word illustration is from a Latin root meaning light up or illuminate. A picture, an illustration, is a visual representation of an actual thing. To illustrate is also to compare. It's a way of understanding one thing by relating it to another. And when we preach, we aren't just kind of retailing the ideas that we find in the Bible. If we were, we'd just be lecturers, conveying information from our own minds into the minds of our hearers. Instead, we are engaging with our congregations in all the rich and fascinating variety of what makes them human. They are, like us, creatures of flesh and blood, with loves and hates and fears. They've known their personal triumphs and disasters, and they have dreams for their future. So, how does the preacher bridge the gap between the words and world of the Bible and the world of those believers today? Well, that's where illustrations come in, because they illuminate, they represent, and they compare. And since it is human lives that are the target of the sermon, what better way of illustrating the Bible than with the rich and fascinating life of the preacher? So that's the theory anyway, but mining our personal lives for the sake of our congregations is riskier than it might appear, and it needs to be done very carefully indeed. So here are some of the pitfalls. The first thing is this: personal stories are personal. And if we aren't discriminating, our sermons can become sort of therapy sessions in which we deal with our personal demons by inflicting them on our congregations. It's a bit like prayers of intercession using I instead of we. The sermon becomes a vehicle for opening up about ourselves. But whatever our personal sadnesses and difficulties, sermons are not fundamentally about us. They are about God. Some of the hardest sermons that I've ever preached were after my divorce, and my life had collapsed around my ears, but I still had to go into the pulpit every Sunday nonetheless. The congregation weren't there to listen to my pain, though privately many of them did. In a Sunday worship service, they were there to encounter God, and it was up to me to help make that happen, no matter how I felt. So, in the pulpit, I just didn't talk about it, and I still believe that was right. Sometimes it's even harder than that. And I recall talking with a funeral director once when I was a young minister, and looking back, I realized that he was trying to educate me. And he told me about a minister who'd been asked to take the funeral of a friend, and partway down, this minister just broke down. He was grief-stricken. And my undertaker friend had spoken sharply to him afterwards and told him, well, you can grieve in your own time. Today, your people just need you to be strong and do your job. Was it harsh? Well, perhaps, but it does illustrate that the necessary gap between the personal and the professional. The second thing is this: personal stories usually make us look good. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure, says Jeremiah. Who can understand it? Even when we're telling a story against ourselves, it's possible to do it in a way that overall still leaves us looking pretty good, and without necessarily even realizing that we're doing it. That tale of family strife, for instance, when I lost my temper because I thought my wife had locked us out of the house on Thursday, and it turned out that it was my fault after all. Well, if you tell that story, the church isn't just hearing that I have a bad temper for which I need forgiveness, which might honestly be my intention. They're also hearing that my wife is smart and competent, which reflects very well on me. And they're hearing a story of personal growth as well, which is always good. Thirdly, other people's stories are personal to them. Actually, that story about getting locked out of the house should have been run by our fictional preacher's wife first. Your family life is private and your family life is sacred. I recall a cartoon depicting a pastor with a newborn baby in his arms with the caption something like, Pastor Jeremiah rejoiced in the birth of a new source of sermon illustrations. And, there's a big debate at the moment about parents who share details of their children's lives on social media. And they might feel that it's just sweet. It's just a way of drawing their circle of acquaintances deeper into their family lives. But what do the children say about it? If they're very young, they don't really have a say. But as they grow older, they might very well object to the choices that their parents made for them. That's equally true, or more so, of the use of our families as sermon fodder. those charming stories about our children's misbehavior told to illustrate the doctrine of original sin might raise a laugh, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily right to tell them. The fourth thing is this. I think that personal stories can make big things too small. So there's nothing wrong with making huge themes accessible by showing how they play out in everyday life. That goes to the heart of preaching, actually. But we need to be wary of pretending that the words of the Psalms, for instance, which are full of weight and depth and texture, are in some way about us. Consider the words of Psalm 27, for instance. When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. Now, what sort of personal story might we tell to illustrate that? Well, the temptation is to identify the wicked with those with whom we disagree or who oppose our pet project. Or we might, if we aren't careful, be reduced to telling stories of family squabbles, again, not negligible in our experience, but unworthy of the richness and the power of the psalmist's thought. Personal stories can be dangerous. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't tell them. It just means that we should be aware of what people are hearing when we do it. We can't empty our sermons of personality without turning them into lectures, but we just need to be careful. One absolutely wonderful preacher who tried to do this, to empty his sermons of personality, was John Henry Newman, one of the three leaders of the High Church Oxford movement in the mid-19th century, now St. John Henry Newman. And he was, for a while, the vicar of St. Mary's in Oxford, the university church, and his sermons became really famous, and they are intriguing reads even today. But Newman was absolutely paranoid about influencing people by appeals to emotion or by the power of his own considerable personality. And he was repelled by the sort of antics that nonconformists like me got up to in the pulpit with their sort of rantings and gesticulations, as he saw it. And so he would stand perfectly still in the pulpit with his arms by his side, reading from his text and relying purely on the force of his ideas to influence the congregation. At least that may have been his intention, though it didn't really work out like that. Matthew Arnold, who was not a fan, once wrote of the charm of that spiritual apparition gliding in the dim afternoon light through the aisles of St. Mary's, rising into the pulpit, and then in the most entrancing of voices, breaking the silence with words and thoughts which were a religious music, subtle, sweet, mournful. And it's quite hard, I think, to imagine that Newman wasn't fully aware of the effect of his technique. And in any case, the attempt to detach his personality from his words was misguided. When we preach, we're bringing our whole selves to the text, and we're trying to speak to the whole of another person. And ironically enough, Newman's own motto, chosen after he'd left the Church of England and become a Catholic, was cor ad cor loquitur, which is heart speaks to heart. And it's not just the mind that speaks to mind in sermons. Heart speaks to heart. And arguably, to connect with our congregations, we're always going to be drawing implicitly on our personal experiences, because our interior lives, which are formed by scripture and prayer and study, and the spiritual discipline of being part of a congregation, will be the fuel that is ignited by the spark of the Spirit when we're in the pulpit. But sometimes the implicit becomes explicit. There's the moment in which our own lives become fused with biblical truth in a way that can't be resisted. And there is, I think, a good biblical warrant for this. One of the most moving of the Old Testament prophetical books is Hosea. And the prophet draws on his own life story, tragic as it is, to preach a sermon to Israel. He marries an unfaithful wife who becomes an emblem of the unfaithfulness of the people of God. His own fidelity through the pain of his domestic situation becomes an emblem of God's faithfulness. And it's hard to get any more personal than this. And it's interesting to see how Hosea keeps most of the rules above. He might be regarded as oversharing, though his focus is almost entirely on God and Israel, not on his wife Gomer and his own feelings. His personal story does not make him look good, certainly in the context of the time when any decently religious man would have turned his wife out or had her stoned. And that, of course, is its shock value when Hosea is replaced by God in the story's structure. And he probably didn't ask her permission to tell the story, but he can't be accused of making a big story too small. If anything, it's the other way round. In Hosea's life, we see Israel reflected in a convex mirror. And this is the key, I think, to understanding how to tell our own stories. They're always to point beyond ourselves. They must help people see not just the preacher who's telling the story, but themselves. And they must ultimately say something about God. So here is a personal story of mine. When I was a very new minister, my church's Sunday school used to support a charity at Christmas and invite a speaker a few Sundays beforehand to talk about the charity. And a lady came up to the front with a young boy and introduced him. "This is my son, and he was born blind." She told of how they coped with him and why the charity that they'd set up for similar children needed support. And the children left for their lessons, and the adults, including the lady and her husband, stayed. And I got up to preach with a feeling of cold horror. And I stumbled through my prepared text, and I closed the service, and I sat down feeling pretty wretched, because I had preached on John chapter 9, the story of the healing of the man who was born blind. And what I'd done was spiritualized a text that, in a situation like theirs, was urgently practical and impossibly challenging. And it felt to me as though I had failed. And worse than that, that I didn't really know how I might have succeeded, because in its own terms, and given that I was a very young preacher, it wasn't a bad sermon. So what does a story like that really mean? I have told this story once or twice, actually, and I think it illustrates, to end where we began, the limitations of our spirituality and the need to approach real human situations with humility rather than thinking that the Bible can solve every problem. And of course, it speaks of the dangers of slapdash preparation. It does not reflect well on the preacher, but it does speak of God, who is there when words, even scriptural words, utterly fail us. There's nothing wrong, I think, with using our own faults and failures to illuminate the path for others, though we should be wary of using our successes to illuminate their path. But it does need to be done carefully, with integrity and with self-knowledge, and with God at the center of each story, rather than ourselves.
Hi everyone, apologies for the interruption. I'd like to tell you about the 2026 edition of Bible Month. Bible Month is a booklet that takes you and your church on a journey through one of the books of the Bible over 4 weeks. For this next edition, we'll be looking to the letter to the Philippians. Paul's letter to the Philippians is bursting with hope, unity and joy, even though he wrote it from prison. It reminds us that true joy isn't about our circumstances, but knowing Jesus Christ and drawing our strength from him. Bible Month is meant to be taken over 4 weeks. You'll be guided through this book, exploring what it means to rejoice in the Lord always, to live in unity, to pray with thanksgiving, and to press on towards the goal that Christ has set before us. Bible Month is about helping churches, small groups, and individuals engage deeply with Scripture together. Find out more and pre-order Bible Month now at www.preachweb.org/Bible Month. That's www.preachweb.org/Bible Month. Thank you so much, Mark, for reading that out so eloquently. There's a lot of richness in this article, and a lot to be covered, and a lot of personal reflection that we might want to consider. So thank you so much. It was so well thought out and put together. Is there anything in there that you might have wanted to add to, elaborate a bit more on?
Yeah. I think I have said this in the article, actually, but I think one of the things I'd say even more clearly is around this idea of bringing our whole selves to the sermon, our whole selves to what we say. I think it's very easy, especially if somebody's come to preaching and has a sort of academic sort of background, maybe if they've done A-levels or been to university or something. It's easy to approach sermon preparation as you might approach writing an essay or something like that. And in some ways, it's not unlike that, in the sense that you've got to do your work, you've got to do your research, you've got to read the commentaries, you've got to pray, you've got to really think it through. But then you need to close them all, and you need to think, right, what is God saying to me through this, me personally, and what have I got to say to the congregation through this? And you draw on not just your reading, you draw on your experience, you draw on your emotions as well as your intellect. I sometimes think that preaching a sermon or learning to preach a sermon is a bit like learning to play the violin, and the Bible is the instrument, and when we start, it's painful because we get things wrong, and maybe we're tied to our notes and we can't lift up our eyes and look the congregation in the face, and all that kind of thing. And we have to learn how to do it. We have to learn how to play the instrument. And when we do, something magical can happen when we make that connection with the congregation. And it's not just us speaking, it's God speaking through us. And those are wonderful moments. I think the other thing, which is a more general thing about preaching, is something which was incredibly helpful to me when I was a very young preacher. And I was I was a student, actually, and in my second year at theological college, I'd been sent to shadow a minister who had just passed retiring age, actually, and that ended up being the church where I went as my first church. And I preached a sermon, and I really didn't think it was very good, and I apologized to him afterwards, and he said, "Oh, don't worry, you can't strike oil every time." And that was, it's such a small thing, and it's such an obvious thing, but I found it so helpful to realize that, if a sermon didn't strike the mark on that particular Sunday, you'd be there again. You'd have another opportunity. I mentioned the Oxford movement and that high church movement earlier, and another one of the leaders in that movement was John Keble, who wrote the hymn "New Every Morning Is the Love," and was a very famous figure in his time. But he was once talking to a student who said that he thought a particular sermon was good that they'd both heard, and Keble just smiled and said, "All sermons are good." And that stayed with me as well, because there's a sense in which all sermons are good, and you can always hear something in them which God has for you, and there's always something that you say which will cut through and speak to somebody else.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I think, just as a congregation member myself, sometimes a sermon, it's lovely and it's wonderful, but it hasn't really pierced my heart in a really amazing way. And I will catch up over tea afterwards with a friend, and they say how their life has changed because of that sermon today.
Yeah.
And that's it, I think.
Yeah.
We're speaking speaking to so many people. So don't ever think that what you've said doesn't fall on at least somebody's heart for the day.
Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, so much for joining us today and reading this article. It's been wonderful to have this conversation about vulnerability and sharing our stories in a way that is helpful and pertinent to the sermon. So thank you so much for this, and it's been great having you on today. Just to let everyone know, if you would like to get a copy of this article, you can purchase the issue individually on our website, preachweb.org/issues. Or if you would like access to this issue and every single other issue before and after this that has been published, you can join our membership, become a member, and read the current issue as well as all of the issues that we have produced so far, and that's preachweb.org/memberships. So thank you, Mark, very much, and I hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.